The army arrived on a Tuesday. There was no drama to it, no trumpets, no war cries, no banners unfurled against a burning sky. Baldric's forces simply appeared on the northern ridge above Aelindor at dawn, the way weather appears gradually, inevitably, and with a weight that could be felt before it was fully seen. The people of the capital woke to find the horizon changed. Where yesterday there had been bare winter fields and the dark line of the Ashrain forest, today there were tents, hundreds of them, stretching along the ridgeline, like a second city made of canvas and iron. Cook fires sent thin columns of smoke into the grey sky. The distant sound of horses and hammers carried on the wind, and at the centre of the encampment, visible even from the city walls, Baldric's personal standard, the black wolf over crossed swords, hung motionless in the still morning air. The city did not panic. Aelindor had seen armies before, but the mood shifted, the way the mood of a household shifts when someone who has been threatening to arrive finally appears at the door. Merchants in the lower quarters began boarding their windows, not out of fear exactly, but out of the practical recognition that proximity to large numbers of armed men was bad for business, regardless of their intentions. The bakers doubled their orders of flour, the wine sellers locked their cellars, and the mothers of the city, who understood the calculus of conflict better than any strategist, quietly began calculating how much food they had stored and how long it would last. Inside Aelindor Keep, the response was more structured but no less anxious. Simon had been awake since before dawn. His chamberlain had brought word of the army's arrival while the prince was still at his writing desk, composing a letter to the Bishop of Calworth that he would never finish. Simon received the news with the outward composure that had become his defining characteristic in the weeks since the Testament reading, the careful, controlled calm of a man who understood that his authority depended on appearing unshaken, even when the ground beneath him was turning to sand. He summoned his council 3 southern lords, the captain of the city guard, the senior bishop present in the capital, and his personal secretary. They gathered in the small council chamber on the keep's second floor, a room with thick walls and a single window that looked north toward the army, that was, depending on one's interpretation, either an act of intimidation or a very expensive way of asking a question. "He hasn't sent terms," the captain of the guard reported. "No heralds, no envoys, no communication of any kind. The army is positioned on the ridge, but has not advanced toward the walls. The supply lines appear to run northeast, toward the Veldmark road." "He's not besieging us," Simon said. "He's waiting." "Waiting for what, my lord? For me to make a mistake?" It was Lauren who answered the question that the council could not. She was not, technically, a member of the council. Women did not sit on war councils in Galandria, and betrothed women who had not yet been crowned sat on nothing at all. But Simon had begun, in recent days, to consult her privately before and after council meetings, and this morning he had simply asked her to attend, offering no explanation to the lords and bishops who raised their eyebrows at her presence. "Baldric doesn't want a siege," Lauren said. "A siege means committing to war, and war means choosing a side that he cannot step back from. Right now he has leverage without commitment. An army on the ridge is a question, not an answer." He's waiting for Simon to respond, because the nature of Simon's response will determine whether this becomes a negotiation or a conflict. The lords looked at her with the particular expression of men who are not accustomed to hearing strategic analysis from a woman in a green dress. If Simon sends envoys offering concessions, Baldric reads it as weakness and raises his demands. If Simon sends threats, Baldric reads it as provocation and advances his position. The only response that maintains Simon's authority is no response at all. A silence that says, "I am the named heir, I hold the capital, and I will not dignify an army with acknowledgement until it declares its purpose." Simon looked at her. The council looked at her. A silence filled the room that was, Lauren thought, approximately 60% political calculation and 40% masculine discomfort. "Lady Lauren's assessment aligns with my own," Simon said quietly. "We wait. We do not provoke. We do not concede. And we prepare for whatever comes next." The council adjourned. The lords filed out with the carefully neutral expressions of men who were not yet ready to admit that the most useful person in the room had been the one they hadn't expected. After they left, Simon turned to Loren. "They don't like you being here," he said. "They don't have to like it. They have to listen. They listened today because you let them. That matters, Simon, more than you think." He looked at her, really looked, the way he had begun to look at her in the past weeks, as though each time he saw her, she came slightly more into focus, revealing details and depths that the initial impression had not captured. "You said something to me on the road to Aelindor," he said, "on the day we arrived. You told me to ask myself what would happen if the testament was real and I was still the wrong choice. I remember. I've been thinking about it ever since. And I've realised that I've been so focused on defending my claim that I haven't asked the more important question, which is what kind of king I actually want to be." Lauren studied his face. There was something there that she had not seen before. Not the anxious determination of a man clinging to a contested crown, but something quieter and more difficult to name. A willingness to be uncertain. A readiness to admit that the path forward might not be the one he had assumed. "That," she said, "is the first thing you've said since I arrived that makes me believe you might actually be good at this." Simon smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it was genuine, and it changed his face in a way that Lauren found herself filing away, not as strategic intelligence, but as something more personal, something she was not yet ready to examine too closely. "Go rest," she said. "I have something I need to attend to this afternoon." "What?" "Archive business." Simon raised an eyebrow. "You spend a great deal of time in the archive. It's a very interesting archive." She left before he could ask anything further. The meeting in the archive took place that afternoon, in the upper gallery, with the winter light falling in cold slants through the narrow windows, and the sounds of the anxious city muffled by stone walls that had stood for 300 years. Elysse was ready. The document case containing the king's letter sat on the gallery table, alongside the signature register, the supply records, and the transcription comparison that she and Edric had assembled over the preceding weeks. It was, taken together, a body of evidence that would have satisfied a royal court of inquiry, methodical, documented, cross-referenced, and anchored by the most powerful piece of all, Conrad's own words, in his own trembling hand, asking for help that had been answered with betrayal. Lauren arrived precisely on time, as always. She ascended the gallery stairs, saw the documents laid out on the table, and stopped. "You've been thorough," she said. "That is my profession," Elysse replied. Lauren sat down and began to read. She started with the supply records, the vellum requisition, the discrepancy in the purchase logs, the 4 sheets of royal-grade parchment against one finished document. She moved to the signature comparison, Elysse's side-by-side presentation of the king's authenticated hand against the testament, with annotations marking the absent tremor, the too consistent pressure, the suspiciously perfect margins. She reviewed the visitor log gap, the timeline of events, the chain of evidence that led from a cracked seal to a midnight passage through a crypt wall, and then she read the king's letter. She read it slowly. She read it twice, and when she finished, she set it down on the table and pressed her fingers to her temples, and for the first time since Elysse had known her, Lauren looked not calculating, not strategic, not one step ahead of everyone in the room, but simply, profoundly moved. He was asking for help, Lauren said. He was frightened and uncertain, and he reached out to the one person he trusted, and that person used his vulnerability to seize control of the succession. Yes, this isn't just a forgery. It's a betrayal of a dying man's trust. Yes. Lauren was quiet for a moment. Then she straightened, and the strategic mind reasserted itself, not replacing the emotion, but incorporating it, the way a river incorporates a tributary and flows stronger for it. The Queen needs to see this, today. Before Baldric loses patience, before Clemens makes another move, before anyone else disappears to a remote monastery. Can you arrange it? I can do more than arrange it. I can make it happen within the hour. Lauren looked at Elysse. But I need you to understand something. Once Marga sees this letter, the decision is hers. Not mine, not yours, not Edric's. She will act according to her own judgment, and her judgment may not align with what we consider just or right. She is a queen. Queens think in kingdoms, not in principles. I understand. And Edric understands? Edric understands that the truth needs to reach someone with the power to use it. What they do with it is beyond our control. Lauren nodded. She gathered the documents, not all of them, but the essential pieces, the king's letter, the signature comparison, and a summary that Elysse had prepared, outlining the chain of evidence. She placed them in the document case with the careful hands of someone who understood that she was holding not just parchment, but the fulcrum on which a kingdom's future would turn. Elysse, Lauren said at the gallery stairs. Yes? When this is over, however it ends, I will not forget what you and Edric have done. I know that sounds like a political promise, and perhaps it is, but it is also a personal one. Elysse nodded. She did not need the promise. She had not done this for recognition or reward, but she accepted it because she understood that Lauren was not merely expressing gratitude. She was acknowledging a debt, and in the world of courts and kingdoms, acknowledged debts were the closest thing to safety that people like Elysse could hope for. Lauren descended the stairs and left the archive. The document case was tucked under her arm, hidden beneath a folded shawl, invisible, unremarkable. The most dangerous collection of parchment in Galandria, disguised as a lady's afternoon accessory. Queen Marga's private chamber was located in the oldest section of Aelindor Keep, a tower room with walls 4 feet thick and a single window that faced west, away from the army on the northern ridge. It was a room designed for privacy, for contemplation, for the kind of conversations that required the assurance that stone and distance provided. Lauren was admitted without question. She had been visiting the Queen almost daily now, and the guards had learned to expect her. They did not search her belongings. They did not question the document case. They simply opened the door and closed it behind her, and the sound of the latch engaging was, Lauren thought, remarkably final. Marga was sitting by the window, her chair angled to catch the afternoon light. She was not reading, not writing, not embroidering. She was simply sitting, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze directed at the sky beyond the glass with the particular stillness of a woman who was holding a great many things in balance and could not afford to move. You have something, Marga said without turning. Yes, Your Grace. Show me. Lauren opened the document case and laid the contents on the table beside the Queen's chair. She did not narrate or explain. She had learned in their conversations that Marga preferred to receive information in silence and process it at her own pace. Narration implied guidance, and Marga did not accept guidance. She accepted evidence and drew her own conclusions. The Queen began with the signature comparison. She studied it for a long time, longer than Lauren had expected. Marga's eyes moved between the authenticated samples of Conrad's handwriting and the testament with the meticulous attention of a woman who had watched her husband sign documents for 28 years, who knew his hand the way a musician knows a familiar melody, who could detect a wrong note even in a technically perfect performance. The tremor, Marga said quietly, his right hand. The last 2 years, absent from the testament, Your Grace. I noticed the night Clemens first presented it. Conrad's hands shook when he lifted a cup. The idea that he wrote this, she touched the testament copy, with this degree of steadiness in his final weeks, is not possible. She set the comparison aside and picked up the King's letter. Lauren watched the Queen read her husband's last authentic words. She watched the stillness in Marga's face, the absolute, practiced control that 30 years of queenship had forged into something almost inhuman. She watched for a crack, a flicker, anything that would indicate the emotional impact of reading. A dead husband's confession of failure and love and desperation. She saw it, finally, in the Queen's hands, not in her face, not in her eyes, in her hands. Marga's fingers tightened on the edges of the parchment, just slightly, just enough to whiten the knuckles for a moment before the grip relaxed again. It was the smallest gesture Lauren had ever seen carry the weight of a lifetime's worth of grief. Marga read the letter. She read it again. And then she set it down on the table and looked out the window for a very long time. He could not choose, she said at last. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a depth that the steadiness was trying, not entirely successfully, to conceal. I told him. For years, I told him. Conrad, you must decide. The kingdom cannot wait for you to reconcile your heart. And he would nod and agree and promise to think on it further. And then another month would pass, and another, and another. She turned to look at Lauren. I loved my husband. I want you to understand that. I loved him deeply, and I have grieved for him every day since his death. But Conrad's greatest failing was not indecision. It was the belief that love could substitute for action. He loved his sons too much to choose between them, and in doing so, he failed them both. And Clemens filled the void, Lauren said. Clemens always fills voids. It is what he does. It is why Conrad trusted him, and it is why Conrad was wrong to trust him. Because Clemens does not fill voids with truth. He fills them with order. And order, in Clemens's mind, is always preferable to honesty. Marga stood. She walked to the window and looked out at the western sky, where the winter sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of iron and amber. My sons are preparing to destroy each other over a piece of parchment that their father never wrote, she said. The church has endorsed a forgery. The nobility has split into factions based on a lie, and the only people who know the truth are a scribe, an archivist, a lord's daughter, and a queen. She paused. It would almost be funny if the consequences were not so terrible. What will you do, Your Grace? Marga did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice had changed. The grief was still there, but it had been folded away, packed down beneath the surface, replaced by something harder and more functional. The voice of a woman who had decided to act, and was now calculating the precise trajectory of that action. How much does Clemens know about what you've assembled? He knows Edric has been asking questions. He offered Edric a position to buy his silence. He removed the scribe who helped with the forgery, Brother Wendell, to a remote monastery, but I do not believe he knows about the king's letter. He believes it is still in the vault. And the vault? Accessed through a passage from the crypt. Edric and Wendell entered it 2 nights ago. The stones were replaced, but the entry would not survive close inspection. Then we have very little time. Clemens is careful, but he is also paranoid, a natural consequence of being the kind of man he is. If he checks the vault and discovers the letter is missing, he will know everything, and he will act to protect himself. Marga turned from the window. I will summon both my sons to the cathedral, tomorrow, at dawn. No armies, no advisors, no bishops, just the 2 of them, in the presence of their mother and the throne of God. And I will show them what their father actually wrote. And if they refuse to come, they will not refuse, because I will send them each the same message. Come to the cathedral unarmed, or I will show the kingdom what your war is truly built upon. Baldric will come, because his honour will not permit him to be the brother who refused his mother's summons. Simon will come, because his intelligence will tell him that a mother who issues such an ultimatum holds a card he cannot afford to ignore. Lauren considered this. It was bold. It was risky. It was, she had to admit, exactly the kind of move that a woman who had spent 3 decades managing 2 proud men and 1 indecisive king would make. And Clemens? Clemens will be there. He will not be invited, but he will come, because the cathedral is his stage, and he will not allow a scene to play out on it without his presence. Marga's voice was cold now, not cruel, but stripped of sentiment, operating in the register of pure strategy. And when he arrives, he will discover that the script has changed. Your Grace, there is one more thing. What? The scribe. Edric. and the archivist, Elysse. They have risked everything to bring this to you. When Clemens learns what has happened, and he will learn, they will be the most vulnerable people in this castle. Marga looked at Lauren with an expression that was difficult to read. Part assessment, part recognition, part something that might, in a less guarded woman, have been called respect. You care about them. They are the reason you are holding that letter instead of a lie, Your Grace. Yes, I care about them. Then bring them to the cathedral tomorrow. They will stand as witnesses. And when this is over, I will see to it that Clemens cannot touch them. She paused. That is not a political promise, Lauren. It is a queen's word. Lauren curtsied. She gathered the documents, all except the king's letter, which Marga kept, folding it carefully and placing it inside her sleeve, where it rested against her skin like a secret with a heartbeat. At the door, Lauren paused. Your Grace. Yes? When you read the letter, your husband's letter, you did not seem surprised. You seemed sad. But not surprised. Marga was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very softly, I have been married to a man who could not choose for 28 years, Lauren. Nothing about that letter surprised me. What surprised me was how much it still hurts to see his handwriting. I thought I had made my peace with his absence. It appears I was wrong. Lauren said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not diminish the weight of what had just been shared. She bowed her head slightly. Not a formal curtsy, but something more personal. A gesture of recognition from one woman to another, and left. In the corridor outside, she leaned against the stone wall and closed her eyes. The document case was empty now, lighter than it had been an hour ago, lighter by the weight of a kingdom's truth. But Lauren did not feel lighter. She felt the gravity of what was coming, the dawn, the cathedral, the confrontation that would either heal a kingdom or shatter it beyond repair. She opened her eyes. She had work to do. The messages went out at sunset. 2 riders departed Aelindor Keep through different gates, one north to the military camp on the ridge, and one to the Abbey of Ashworth, where Abbot Clemens would receive the Queen's invitation to attend a dawn service at the cathedral. The messages were identical in their brevity and devastating in their implication. To Baldric. Your mother requests your presence at the Cathedral of St. Aldwyn at first light. Come alone. Come unarmed. The matter concerns your father's final wishes. If you do not come, the kingdom will learn what I have learned, and you will learn it from the mouths of strangers rather than from the lips of your mother. To Simon. Your mother requests your presence at the Cathedral of St. Aldwyn at first light. Come alone. Come unarmed. The matter concerns your father's final wishes. What you believe about your claim will change before the sun clears the walls. Come, and change with it, or stay, and be changed without your consent. To Clemens. The Queen requests the honour of your presence at a dawn service in the Cathedral of St. Aldwyn. The service will concern the spiritual legacy of King Conrad. Your attendance is expected. The last message was the most calculated. Marga had composed it herself, choosing every word with the precision of a woman who had been managing Clemens's ego for 2 decades. It did not threaten. It did not reveal. It simply invited, in a tone that made the invitation indistinguishable from a command, and that carried, beneath its courtesy, the unmistakable implication that refusing was not an option the abbot could afford. Lauren found Elysse in the archive just before the evening bell. Tomorrow, Lauren said. Dawn. The cathedral. Elysse looked up from her work. It's happening? The Queen has summoned both princes and the abbot. She will present the letter. She wants you and Edric there as witnesses. Elysse set down her quill. She was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of hesitation, but the silence of a person absorbing the reality that the thing she had been working toward for weeks was now 12 hours away. I'll send word to Edric, she said. Be careful. If Clemens suspects. Clemens watches the abbey's gates. He does not watch the kitchen passage. A pause. I have been doing this for 3 weeks, Lauren. I know which corridors are safe. Lauren smiled. I keep underestimating you. Most people do. I find it useful." They looked at each other for a moment. Two women who had come from entirely different worlds and arrived at the same place, bound together by a shared understanding that the truth was not just an abstraction, but a physical thing, written on parchment, carried in hands, passed from one person to another in a chain that was only as strong as the trust between its links. "Tomorrow then," Lauren said. "Tomorrow." Edric received the message that evening, delivered through the kitchen passage by a boy who worked in the keep's scullery, and who believed he was carrying a note about a supply order for archive candles. The note, written in Elysse's hand, said simply, "Dawn, St. Aldwyn's, bring nothing, be there." He did not sleep that night. He lay on his narrow bed in his abbey cell and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the monastery settling into its nighttime rhythms. The distant chanting of the late office, the creak of wooden beams contracting in the cold, the soft footsteps of the night porter making his rounds. These were the sounds that had accompanied every night of his life for 13 years. They were as familiar as his own heartbeat, and tonight he heard them the way a man hears familiar sounds on the last night before a journey, with a tenderness sharpened by the knowledge that he might not hear them again. He thought about Clemens. Not with anger. He had not been able to maintain anger at the abbot, despite everything. What he felt was something more complicated, a grief for the relationship that had been, and a clear-eyed understanding of the relationship that it actually was. Clemens had raised him. Clemens had educated him. Clemens had given him purpose and skill and a place in the world. And Clemens had also used the institution that sheltered him as a tool for political manipulation, and had asked him to be complicit, and had removed the one man who could testify to the forgery, and had done all of this, while genuinely believing, with the terrifying sincerity of a man whose moral compass pointed true north, even when true north led off a cliff, that he was doing God's work. Edric did not hate Clemens, he pitied him, and he feared him, and he was going to stand in a cathedral at dawn and help dismantle the edifice that Clemens had constructed, because the truth demanded it, and because a dead king's last reel. Words deserved to be heard, and because somewhere, in an archive across the castle, a woman with sharp eyes and steady hands was counting on him to be there. He rose before dawn. He dressed in his simplest robe. He left the abbey through the kitchen entrance, a route that had become as familiar to him as the corridor to the scriptorium, and walked through the empty streets of Aelindor toward the cathedral. The city was silent. The army on the ridge was silent. The keep was silent. Everything was holding its breath, the way everything had held its breath on the night the king died, except that this time the breath was about to be released. The Cathedral of St. Aldwyn was the oldest building in Aelindor, older than the keep, older than the walls, older than the kingdom itself. It had been built in an age when stone was the only language that could speak to God, and its builders had spoken eloquently. Soaring arches, vaulted ceilings, narrow windows that caught the first light of dawn and scattered it across the flagstone floor in patterns of gold and shadow. It was a building designed to make human beings feel small, and it succeeded. Edric arrived first. He stood in the nave, in the grey half-light before sunrise, and looked up at the ceiling at the stone ribs, arching overhead like the skeleton of some enormous creature, at the stained glass windows waiting for the sun to bring them to life, and felt, for a moment, the particular awe that sacred architecture is designed to inspire. Whatever he thought about the church's politics, whatever he knew about the men who wielded its authority, the building itself was innocent. It existed outside of conspiracy and calculation. It was simply beautiful, and old, and enduring, and in its presence, the machinations of kings and abbots felt very small indeed. Elysse arrived next, entering through a side door that connected to the cathedral's chapter library. She wore her plain wool dress, her hair pinned simply, her expression composed. She came to stand beside Edric, and for a moment neither of them spoke. They simply stood together in the cathedral's silence, shoulder to shoulder, and let the weight of the morning settle around them. "Are you frightened?" Elysse asked. "Yes," Edric said. "Are you?" "Terrified." She paused. "But I've been terrified for 3 weeks, so I've had time to get used to it." He almost laughed. It was not a moment for laughter, but the impulse was there, the recognition that fear, shared between two people who trust each other, becomes something smaller, something almost manageable. Lauren arrived. Then, minutes later, Abbot Clemens sweeping into the cathedral in his finest vestments, flanked by 2 monks, his face wearing the expression of serene confidence that he reserved for occasions of spiritual significance. He saw Edric. He saw Elysse. His expression did not change, but something behind it, some mechanism of assessment, engaged and began to calculate. Simon came through the main entrance, alone as instructed, wearing his blue prince's robes and the uncertain expression of a man walking into a situation whose parameters he does not fully understand. He saw Lauren and moved toward her instinctively. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, and he stopped, understanding that this was not a moment for closeness, but for composure. And then, as the first light of dawn began to touch the cathedral's eastern windows, Baldric entered. He came through the western door, the warrior's entrance, the door through which knights traditionally entered for their vigils. He wore no armour, as instructed. He wore a simple dark tunic and leather boots, and without his military trappings, he looked unexpectedly human, younger, less certain, more like the second son's older brother than a military commander with 600 knights on a ridge. Henrik was not with him. Baldric had come alone, as his mother had demanded, and the act of coming alone, of walking into the cathedral without his loyal shadow, was itself a statement of trust, or at least of willingness to hear what needed to be heard. The 2 brothers saw each other across the length of the nave. They did not speak. They did not need to. The space between them, 50 feet of ancient flagstone, lit by the first rays of sun filtering through stained glass, said everything that words could not. It was the distance between 2 men who had grown up in the same castle, played in the same corridors, loved the same father, and been driven apart by a piece of parchment that neither of them had written. And then Queen Marga entered. She came through the sacristy door, the private entrance reserved for royal worship, and she walked to the centre of the nave with the unhurried authority of a woman who had been the most powerful person in rooms full of powerful men for longer than either of her sons had been alive. She wore black, as she had worn every day since Conrad's death, and in the cathedral's rising light, she looked like something carved from the same stone as the building itself, ancient, enduring, immovable. She stopped in the space between her sons. She looked at each of them in turn, and then she looked at Clemens. "Close the doors," she said. The cathedral doors were closed. The sound echoed through the nave like the ceiling of a tomb. "What you are about to hear," Marga said, "will change what you believe about your father, about this kingdom, and about the man who has guided this succession from the shadows. I ask only that you listen before you speak, and that you remember, all of you, that the man who wrote the words I am about to read loved you, both of you, more than he loved his own certainty. And that was both his greatest virtue and his most devastating failure." She reached into her sleeve and withdrew the letter. And in the Cathedral of St. Aldwyn, in the first light of a winter dawn, with the stained glass casting patterns of gold and crimson across the stone floor, the Queen of Galandria began to read her husband's last true words aloud. The silence that followed was the deepest that any of them had ever known. Edric stood beside Elysse at the edge of the nave and watched the letter do its work. He watched Baldric's face, the way it moved through stages of recognition, confusion, anger, and finally something that looked like the exhaustion of a man who has been fighting for so long that he has forgotten what the fight was about. The elder prince's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, and his jaw worked as though he were chewing on words that refused to form. He watched Simon's face, the way the colour drained from it gradually, like ink being diluted, as the realisation settled that his claim to the throne rested not on his father's will, but on a monk's fabrication. Simon did not clench his fists. He simply stood very still, his arms at his sides, his eyes fixed on the letter in his mother's hands as though it were a mirror showing him a reflection he had never expected to see. He watched Clemens, and this, he would later reflect, was the most difficult thing he had ever watched. The abbot did not crumble. He did not confess. He did not rage or deny or collapse into the theatrical guilt that lesser men might have performed. He simply stood in his fine vestments, his hands clasped, his face composed in an expression of absolute stillness, and listened to the words of the man he had betrayed with the steady, unwavering attention of a man who had already made his peace with what he had done, and was now merely observing its consequences. When Marga finished reading, the silence in the cathedral was so complete that Edric could hear the candles burning on the altar. Baldric spoke first. He never chose. His voice was rough, scraped raw by something that was not quite anger and not quite grief. He never chose either of us. No, Marga said, and the testament was written by Abbot Clemens, in your father's hand, with your father's seal, without your father's knowledge or consent. Every eye in the cathedral turned to Clemens. The abbot met their gaze. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He looked, in that moment, like a man standing on a cliff edge, not because he had been pushed there, but because he had walked there deliberately, knowing that the edge was coming, and had chosen to face the view rather than the fall. It is true, Clemens said. His voice was calm, clear, unrepentant. I wrote the testament. I sealed it with the king's signet. I presented it to this court as the authentic will of your father, and I would do it again. The words landed like stones in still water. Because your father's letter, the letter the Queen has just read, is not a solution. It is a surrender. A king who cannot choose between his sons has not given his kingdom a path forward. He has given it a void. And voids, in my experience, are filled not by the wise, but by the violent. Without the testament, this kingdom would have descended into chaos within a week of Conrad's death. The testament gave Galandria what it needed: certainty, direction, a name on the throne, and a reason for the lords to stand down. A lie, Baldric said. A foundation, Clemens replied. Lies and foundations are not always different things, my lord. Half the institutions in this kingdom rest on stories that are more convenient than true. The question is not whether the foundation is honest. The question is whether the building it supports is worth preserving. It was, Edric thought, the same argument Clemens had made to him in the chapter house, but stripped now of its private intimacy, delivered in the echoing nave of a cathedral, before an audience that included the two men most damaged by it. And it was still, even now, terrifyingly persuasive. But Marga was not persuaded. You are eloquent, Clemens, the Queen said. You have always been eloquent. It is your greatest talent and your most dangerous flaw, because it allows you to mistake the beauty of an argument for its truth. She held up the king's letter. My husband asked you for help. He asked you, as a friend, to find a path that would spare his sons, and you answered by taking the decision out of his hands entirely. Not to serve him, not to serve the kingdom, but to serve your own vision of what the kingdom should be. My vision preserved the peace. Your vision placed my son on a throne he may not have earned, drove my other son to the edge of war, and built the legitimacy of the crown on a document you fabricated in a scriptorium. Marga's voice did not rise. It did not need to. That is not preservation, Clemens. That is control. And you have confused the two for so long that you can no longer tell the difference. The abbot fell silent. For the first time since Edric had known him, in all the years of sermons and councils, and quiet conversations in the chapter house, Clemens had nothing to say. Edric felt Elysse's hand brush against his. Not grasping, not holding, just touching. A point of contact in the middle of a moment that felt, despite the cathedral's warmth, as cold and clarifying as winter itself. Marga turned to her sons. Your father could not choose, she said. and I will not repeat his mistake by choosing for him. But I will tell you what I believe, and you will listen, because I have earned the right to be heard." She looked at Baldric. "You are your father's courage. You have defended this kingdom with your body and your blood, and there is not a man in Galandria who does not owe you a debt for it. But courage without wisdom is just destruction with good intentions." She looked at Simon. "You are your father's mind. You have built alliances, secured trade, and kept this kingdom prosperous through diplomacy and patience. But wisdom without strength is just cleverness waiting to be overrun." She looked at both of them. "Your father needed both of you. The kingdom needs both of you. And if you go to war with each other, you will each destroy the half of Calandria that the other one was meant to protect." The morning light had fully risen now. The stained glass windows blazed with colour, deep reds, golds, blues, casting the cathedral's interior in the vivid, almost unbearable beauty of a winter sunrise filtered through centuries-old glass. In that light, the Queen stood between her sons, and the Abbot stood alone, and the scribe and the archivist stood at the edge, witnesses to the moment when a kingdom stopped holding its breath. At the cathedral door, as the morning light flooded the nave and the weight of what had just happened began to settle over all of them, like dust after an earthquake, Marga turned to Edric. He had not expected her to address him. He was, by every measure of rank and station, the least important person in the room. A scribe, a monk, a carpenter's son who had learned to hold a quill. But the Queen looked at him with an expression that he could not immediately read, something between gratitude and assessment, between acknowledgement and calculation. "You gave me the truth," she said. "Yes, Your Grace. Now watch what I do with it." Edric felt Elysse's hand find his, not brushing this time, but taking hold, her fingers interlacing with his, warm and certain and unapologetic. He held on. In the cathedral light, with the kingdom's future hanging in the balance, and the most powerful people in Galandria standing within arm's reach, he held the hand of the woman who had made all of this possible. And he did not let go. Marga saw this. The Queen's expression shifted just slightly, just for a moment, into something that might, in a different woman, have been a smile. Then she turned to face her sons, and the business of kingdoms resumed.